There are forces of good and forces of evil at work in the world today. What are these forces? Who is responsible for the good? And who is responsible for the evil? Richard Shoff talks about current events which are rarely discussed by the mainstream media, events that affect us all. This program seeks to identify, to inform, and to equip the believer for what's ahead. Welcome to What in the World is Going On?
This is What in the World is Going On. I'm your host, Richard Shoff. Program sponsored by Lincoln Log Homes of Kannapolis, North Carolina. We are pro-Christian, pro-American, pro-life, pro-Second Amendment, here only by the grace of God. We're also on YouTube 24/7. Dial it up. What in the World is Going On? By Richard Shoff. Let's take a look at the world scene a little bit, starting over in Europe. You know, our president was over there a while back. Made a lot of fun of him, put him down. Since then, we see the French riots. They prove that the Paris Accord is totally and fatally flawed. Trump said that quite a while ago. During a demonstration a week ago, today's Saturday, as I'm taping this, the demonstrators were going against raising taxes, which turned into scenes of rioting in the Paris city center. Well, President Donald Trump claims the fuel tax riots in France justify his decision to yank the U.S. out of the totally flawed Paris climate deal. I'm glad that my friend Emmanuel Macron and the protesters in Paris have agreed with the conclusion I reached 2 years ago, a Trump tweet. He continued, the Paris Agreement is fatally flawed because it raises the price of energy for responsible countries while whitewashing some of the worst polluters in the world. End tweet. Trump added he's been making great strides in improving America's environment, but suggested the Paris Agreement put the burden for environmentally friendly policies on the backs of American taxpayers. The tweet came after France delayed plans to implement steep taxes on diesel fuel and gasoline as part of Macron's effort to reduce emissions. Last month, Trump dismissed a government report that warned of dire circumstances if our country doesn't address climate change. Yeah. And let's look a little bit behind the scenes at what's happening over in France. Trump gets the last laugh on Macron with Paris burning. This after Macron's rebuke of the America First president that we have. French President Macron rebuked our president last month for putting the interest of U.S. citizens about demonstrating moral values. 3 weeks later, Paris was ablaze by thousands of working-class protesters. They were objecting to Macron's promoting an environmentally friendly fuel tax. Well, Macron is about half as popular in France as Trump is in the U.S. Macron has set himself up as the enemy of nationalist leaders across Europe. But they're all more popular than he is. The Trump administration called for European countries to ditch the leadership of the United Nations and the European Union and instead to join the U.S. in putting the interests of their own citizens first. As Macron backpedals on his high-minded fuel tax without appeasing the protesters, it looks as if Trump is having the last laugh. President Emmanuel Macron stood in his Arc de Triomphe last month and rebuked President Donald Trump's America First policy, this at a ceremony marking the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. It was a move that all by accounts infuriated our president. Trump went home from Paris being roundly mocked for the wide perception that he let rainfall keep him from honoring the fallen soldiers, and he fumed at Macron on Twitter. I think I told you the background on why our president didn't go out that one day. Marine One was not equipped. It wasn't safe for him to fly in it. The driving time was to take our president out of range on security purposes from Air Force One. The president's plane was at the airport. The drive was too far away. Our security forces told the president he could not go for secure reasons. He could only be so far away and so much out of touch with the facilities that are aboard Air Force One. But of course, they like to put him down. It was the rain, you know. Well, 3 weeks later, protesters stormed the monument in central Paris, a massive violent riot that saw it defaced with slogans calling for Macron's resignation and leaving the statue of Miriam, the symbol of the French Revolution, with its face smashed in. Patriotism is the exact opposite of nationalism. Macron said that on November 11th. Nationalism is a betrayal of patriotism. By saying our interests first, who cares about the others? We erase what a nation holds dearest, what gives its life, what makes it great, and what's essentially its moral values. His remarks were widely seen as a slap in the face of our president, but they fell on deaf ears among even his own countrymen. France's lower middle classes in the intervening weeks launched a massive mobilization that saw over 36,000 marching in colors in the streets of Paris. The French who felt unseen, who felt Macron had not put their interests first, donned high-visibility yellow vests to protest their president's raising the taxes on the diesel fuel, a move designed to make the country's economy more green. While Macron may have sought to improve the lot of all French people by building a green economy that could attract morally sound investments from around the world, the tax increases immediately hurt the suburban and rural working class. In return, it provides only a theoretical, roundabout path toward their long-term gain. Macron's high-minded rhetoric fell flat among these workers, and after the destruction in Paris, Macron made the first major reversal of his presidency and called off the tax increase. He was beaten by protests that he initially dismissed. Well, Macron's U-turn wasn't enough, and the Yellow Vests, as they've come to be known, have planned more protests for the weekend that we're in right now, today in fact. Any working theory of international relations understands that nations and actors put their own interests first. Whereas Trump proudly trumps America first, Macron essentially said he's more interested in signaling his country's moral values than advancing the interests of his own citizenry. Today, Macron's approval rating stands at about 32%, while Trump's is double that, at about 46%. Macron has positioned himself as the enemy of nationalistic leaders rising around Europe. But leaders like Hungary's anti-refugee Viktor Orban and Italy's Matteo Salvini remain more popular than he does in their respective countries. While Trump is often clashed with European leaders over his unilateral decisions to withdraw from the Paris Agreement on climate changes or the Iran nuclear deal in the name of American interests, Europe's unity and leadership has weakened terribly. Macron's chief ally, Chancellor Angela Merkel, lost recent elections and has announced plans to step down when her term's in 21. In a speech to Europe's leadership in Brussels, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo blasted multinational, multilateral institutions like the United Nations and the European Union as ineffective in failing to address the concerns of the people. Pompeo called on noble nations around the world to put their interests first and reform or eliminate multinational bodies that don't work as intended. Pompeo pointed to China and Russia disregarding the treaties and asserting their national wills as evidence that undemocratic countries were reaping the benefits of the liberal world order, while Europe failed to act. On Twitter, Trump teased Macron as having only now come around to the realization that imposing costs on workers to pay for a grand vision of global change had proven untenable. While champions of morality and politics may have celebrated Macron's rebuke of Trump's America First policies, which are often seen as inhuman, and turning away from the U.S. must publicize values of compassion and openness, the massive mobilization of the Yellow Vests and the downfall of liberal leaders across Europe may yet give Trump the last laugh on the whole situation. Then the French MPs launch a no-confidence vote, this all amid the nationwide anger in the riots that's going on in France. Macron's leadership is hanging by a thread as left-wing groups within the French parliament discussed launching a no-confidence vote against their president. Macron and Prime Minister Edouard Philippe popularity ratings have hit new lows as the Yellow Vest protests gathered speed. This according to a recent French poll. The young centrist has been hit by a wave of popular discontent over his planned echo tax rise, which quickly morphed into a broader rebuke of his aloof leadership style and his tough policies. Mr. Macron's satisfaction rating fell to 23% in November. That was down 6 points from the previous month. That was a poll for Paris Match and Sud Radio. Mr. Philippe's approval rating fell by 10 points to 26%. 76% of those interviewed said they were dissatisfied with Macron's actions as president, with half stressing they totally disapproved of his actions. The 40-year-old leader's score now matches the low recorded by his socialist predecessor, Francisco Hollande, in the late 2013s. This according to the Paris Match. Mr. Hollande is widely considered to be the least popular head of state in modern French history. BFM TV says left-wing parties within the French parliament have agreed to discuss a no-confidence vote against Macron's government. The French Communist Party and the Socialist Party are leading the rebellion. Last Tuesday, his centralist government caved in and surrendered to the rioters. They announced a 6-month suspension on the fuel tax increase, but not a shuttling of it. This in response to the violent protests, which are now in their fourth week now. However, the measure is seen as too little too late by many protesters whose anger is increasingly focused on the embattled centralist. The suspension marks must watch the first major U-turn by the Macron administration after 18 months in power. And now, this very weekend, beleaguered Macron predicts major violence across France. Right now, as I speak, Saturday before the Sunday broadcast. Protesters across France are set to take to the streets again today, despite the government caving in over the controversial fuel price hike. Macron's approval rating crashed below 20% as he predicted major violence across France this weekend, folks, right now. The beleaguered head of state is locked in a law and order crisis as thousands of so-called Yellow Vest protesters continue to demonstrate against the government. As he said, his popularity is plummeting. Despite a humiliating government U-turn on the taxes, on the fuel, the Yellow Vests seem that they can achieve even more. The group is named after the high-visibility jacket that all motors have to carry in France, and originally called for a reduction in the price of fuel on diesel and petrol. Just a few quotes from various sources. The Associated Press says Macron is facing more unrest across France, despite caving in. Reuters says hundreds of people have been arrested in the last 3 weeks following the riots. Now distinguished groups from left and right, including students and emergency workers, have joined their campaign. This has ensured that Macron's approval rating, his lowest since he took office, is now just 18%. The 18% figure represents that drop of 3 points. Macron came to power in 2017 as an independent, pledging to reform the country's sluggish economy and to introduce ecological measures in line with the Paris climate change control. So much for France. Europe is finished. This according to a leading attorney as he leaves the United Kingdom for Israel. It's time to wander again. A quote from Mark Lewis. He's telling his fellow Jews that are facing anti-Semitism in Britain and across Europe. This top British lawyer and his partner immigrated to Israel this week, citing rising anti-Semitism in Europe. Sure, folks, they're inundated with illegals, Muslims. Europe, in my view, is finished, he said. Every day you see people being attacked in one way or another across Europe. A quote from Mark Lewis. He said this on Israel's Channel 10 News. He was accompanied by his partner, Mandy Blumenthal. They were speaking at Israel Ben Gurion Airport. He said, and I quote, you see people murdered in museums in Belgium, people murdered in schools in France, people attacked in England. There's only one place for Jewish people to go, he added. Lewis, one of the UK's leading libel attorneys, said he's been increasingly subjected to hate speech and threats for being Jewish, including being subjected to regular abuse and death threats online. The decision to leave Britain did not come easily, he said, but the couple feels that it was inevitable. We're a wandering people, and it's time to wander again. People just don't want to see it, Lewis said of his fellow British Jews. We've accelerated our decision of moving to go to Israel because of anti-Semitism being so institutional and accepted in mainstream life. A quote from Blumenthal. So many people have these ideas about Jews being responsible for every disaster that's ever happened in the world. Lewis and Blumenthal first publicized their intention to leave for Israel in an interview with the BBC last August. They said they knew other people who were considering leaving because of the country's anti-Semitism. Isn't it strange, folks? But, isn't there a scripture on the nations and people that support Israel and those that turn their back on those people? I think I saw it someplace in the Bible. That's what happens when you load up with Muslims, legal or illegal. And by the way, Trump's been proven right. A recent Harris poll showed his approval up to 46%. President Donald Trump's approval rating rose to 46% from 44% in October. Trump's numbers show an uptick as voters continue to give him credit on the economy and battling terrorism successfully. This according to a Harvard CAPS Harris poll co-director Mark Penn. He said in a Penn, I'm quoting Penn, his job approval and the basic numbers have been stable over the last few months. Just a few results from the survey show 52% of registered voters believe the country is on the wrong track, while 40% believe it's headed in the right direction. 70% say the economy is strong, but only 47% say it's on the right track. Have a little trouble trying to figure that one out, don't you? The Republican Party approval has slightly increased to 43%. 67% of voters are satisfied with the outcome of the midterms. Only 33% of Democrats want House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi to be House Speaker, while 67% would prefer someone else. Well, guess why they got her? What happened, folks? They got what they wanted. Meanwhile, while all this is going on, David Hodges over at the Common Sense Show points out that America should immediately exit 3 groups in order to survive. I like his thinking. There are 3 organizations that America must exit immediately if the Constitution and our standard of living is to survive. The 3 groups whose actions demand our quick and immediate withdrawal from are NATO, the United Nations, and any form of central banking participation. NATO, the United Nations, and the central banks are working towards a unification of the planet from a political, economic, and cultural basis. There are very specific dangers that globalization holds for America. As an American citizen, we have the only system of government that is a constitutional republic in which civil liberties are enumerated and guaranteed regardless of who is in power. At best, there are other nations that say their people have such liberties as freedom of speech. However, they exist as a communitarian system of government in which rights are only guaranteed until it's no longer in the greater good. And, by the way, who decides what's in the greater good or the common interest? Why the need to withdraw from NATO? Well, Macron does not need to raise a European army to oppose Russia, China, and the U.S., as he stated last week. NATO has already become the de facto army of the European Union. On behalf of their central banker benefactors, NATO is doing its best to provoke World War III with Russia. They're rallying along the Russian border in a clear attempt to provoke a Russian response. Some U.S. congressmen, and you hear them regularly on the news media, are saying the same thing. NATO is helping the Ukraine military challenge Russia, violate territorial waters, and provoke Russian ships on the high seas. It's obvious that NATO is looking for a trigger event that could well set off World War III. There's not one action that NATO's taking in terms of supporting the needs of the American people or its government. Yet, American financial support forms the backbone of the organization. The time to exit has come, and there's an immediate need to withdraw. If we don't withdraw, millions of Americans could well die in the war NATO is trying to provoke. And why do we need to withdraw from the UN? Well, I can remember many years ago when they said it was time to move the UN out of the U.S. and get the U.S. out of the UN. Too bad it didn't happen 40 years ago. The United Nations can be characterized as a collection of tin-horn dictatorships that they don't respect the rule of law. They fully embrace socialism, which has miserably failed everywhere it's been employed. The UN fully embraces forced vaccinations, abortion, assisted suicides. They hold Christianity in disdain and frequently legislate against the religion. Their peacekeepers are anything but peacekeepers. They're frequently present when genocide is going on, and the best example was Rwanda. The clear goal of the UN is to ensure the complete sovereignty of each member state. If the people of this country ever become a member of any other nation, any nation at all, they will see what is happening. They'll see global governance overseen by the UN, where we could expect to see complete loss of our constitutional guaranteed freedoms. Under the UN, our border security would be erased, thus opening the door to terrorists entering in with bad intentions. We're seeing it happen right now. You're going to experience the loss of self-expression, your right to bear arms in self-defense, and there will likely be no real due process. The time to exit the UN is now, and folks, the need is immediate. Certainly the Federal Reserve must be nationalized. Presently, the Federal Reserve is raising interest in the midst of a low inflationary environment. They just changed it a little bit this past week, thanks to the market going down. This, folks, is devastating to an economy, and it's contributing to the ups and downs of the stock market, as we've seen this past week. The Federal Reserve could win the day for globalism. They'd rather do that than to protect the dollar. Why does the Federal Reserve oppose Trump? And why is it willing to deliberately hurt the economy? Could it be because they oppose his brand of nationalism? They're dedicated to the formation of a globalist New World Order. Did you know? Think about this. From 1800 to 1913, the value of the dollar remained unchanged. But after the creation of the Federal Reserve in 1913, the value of the dollar had dropped to 3 cents by 2015. The time to leave the Federal Reserve is now. The debt, owed almost exclusively to the bankers, needs to be repudiated. We're being assimilated into the collective economy of the future. Our freedoms, our sovereignty are at risk. The only solution is for President Trump to use his power to withdraw from all three groups. Putin and China are in the same boat. Russia and America should form the new alliance with Russia. This after we fire Mueller and indict every Democrat congressional person who's aligned with foreign elements and have declared these allegiances. People such as Feinstein, Schumer, Pelosi. Russia and America are the new NATO. Debt repudiation is a new economic policy. This is all about nationalism, folks. Nationalism versus globalism. It is 30 seconds to midnight. It's time, folks. It's time. And folks, our president has been so successful, as we've just covered, in spite of everything that's against him. The forces of hell have risen against him. And yet, he's proving the other side wrong. He's proving that socialism, globalism don't work. Look what's happened, not just in France. England, Prime Minister May probably being forced out. Brexit not being fulfilled. In Germany, as I mentioned, Merkel not going to run again in Germany. In Spain, the newly elected socialist government is losing local elections to the far right. And how is Trump doing? In spite of all the forces of hell against him, he's doing pretty good out there, folks. Doing pretty good. And I'd like to talk to you in our remaining time about an ex-Muslim Christian pastor. He took refuge here from Iran. He's been arrested for sharing his Christian testimony, not in Iran, not in Turkey, but in Minnesota. Late last month, Raman Paras, a Christian pastor who fled Iran as a religious refugee, was arrested for privately sharing his faith testimony in the Mall of America in Bloomington, Minnesota. He fled persecution in Iran and Turkey, only to find persecution in the land of the free, in the home of the brave. I came to the U.S. as a political and religious, as a Christian refugee. They oppressed me for my faith in Iran. I was stabbed in Turkey, Parsa told PJ Media in a recent interview. Then he was arrested for a private conversation about his Christian faith. He was handcuffed to a metal chair for 4 hours without water and later charged with trespassing. These things might happen in other countries, in oppressive dictatorships, but not in America, the pastor said. Parsa, a pastor of Redemptive Love Ministry International, a group out of Los Angeles, traveled to Minnesota for 2 days to visit 2 different churches. He went to the Mall of America in August with an elder from one of the churches and with the elder's 14-year-old son. Shortly after entering the mall, he struck up a conversation with 2 Somali American women. Our conversation was casual. At first, we were not talking about the gospel, Parsa recalled. They asked me, "Are you a Muslim?" And I said, "No. I used to be a Muslim, and I'm a Christian now." I was telling them the story of my conversion. A passerby could not stand the discussion, however. Another lady told the guard, "This guy's harassing us." The mall security came and told Parsa to stop soliciting. He said, "We're not soliciting." But we left, the pastor explained. The pastor and his friends went into a coffee shop, bought a latte, and came out. Parsa told PJ Media he thought that would be the end of it. But boy, was he mistaken. When we came out of the coffee shop, 3 guards were waiting for us. They arrested me right there, the pastor recalled. They came after me and arrested me and said, "You can't talk religion here." Parsa told security he was a pastor. They told him, "We arrest pastors. We've arrested them before." He recalled this. Also, he was shocked by their answer. It was something that wasn't normal. They were used to it. Meanwhile, the 2 Somali American women who wanted to hear the pastor's story argued with the woman who reported him to security. They defended Parsa. Onlookers asked why the man was being arrested. They said because he's a Christian. Wow. In America? All this was bad enough, but the guards proceeded to abuse the pastor once he was in custody. They handcuffed both of his hands to a metal chair that was bolted to the ground in a basement. Parsa explained this. He said it reminded him of the KGB, the secret police of the Soviet Union. They began to file a report and they wanted to take my picture. And he said, "You can't take my picture. You arrested me wrongfully." The pastor recalled this and they said, "Then you're going to stay here a long time." Later, Parsa asked for a glass of water. They refused unless he would allow them to take his picture. He asked to go to the restroom. Again, they refused. Shortly before the police came, his captors relented. I was arrested, handcuffed, and tied to a chair by the Mall of America. I was refused water, the men's room, attorney. They didn't even tell me my rights. And then taken by Bloomington Police Department, only for sharing my conversation with some Muslim women. And they had wanted to hear it. Little background, folks. They gave me a half a cup, a really small cup of water. They were trying to buy me with that water. Then, after 4 hours, the police arrived. The police came to open my handcuffs. The handcuffs were very tight, and they were hurting my hands, Parsa recalled. The guard said, "I don't think it hurts that much." He suggested that the security guards treated him with special malice because he was a pastor. "I believe they treated me worse for being a pastor," he insisted. The Mall of America would not respond to PJ Media's request for comment. After the police took the pastor's mugshot and fingerprints, they charged him with a criminal trespassing. He paid $78 to bail himself out, and his friends picked him up at 2 a.m. While that bail amount was low, the pastor insisted every cent is too much to have to pay when I haven't done anything wrong. "I've gone through this before in Muslim countries. I was arrested for passing out Bibles," Parsa said. I didn't expect that would happen in America. As a citizen of America, I've got rights. They denied my basic rights. The pastor compared the mistreatment he suffered in Minnesota to the persecution he faced in Iran and in Turkey. When I became a Christian, I was stabbed. I ran away from Iran. I went to Turkey for 2 years as a refugee. We had a church there and were passing out Bibles. I was arrested again, he recounted. He mentioned Pastor Andrew Brunson, an American pastor in prison in Turkey and charged at one time with terrorism. They thought the American government was paying us to pass out Bibles. Pastor said, I wish they would do that. When at last he came to America, he was relieved. With tears in my eyes, I was so thankful to be in America, where I can express myself. Nobody can stop me or oppress me for my faith. And then this happened, Pastor said. When his family heard the news, they thought it couldn't possibly be possible, that it couldn't happen in America. When they realized it had happened here, they were really shocked, the pastor noted. He posted about the ordeal on Facebook, and shortly thereafter, the government of Iran arrested his cousin for handing out Bibles in Iran. This in the United States. What's happened, folks? Pray for America.